A few weeks ago, something interesting happened. I was just having a usual day on YouTube doing what I do best, watching other people debate each other. But then I stumbled upon something I found pretty interesting. This one YouTuber, a former Catholic who refers to himself as Kevigen of Alexandria, was up against some kind of Catholic philosopher. I don't really know the other guy that well. Anyways, since I myself am no longer a Catholic but a Platonist pagan, I decided to look through Kevigen's channel, and lo and behold, I was actually pretty impressed with some of the arguments he was making against Catholic tradition. He wasn't just recycling bland talking points, but instead he seemed to have a genuine knowledge of church history and the catechism, which makes a lot of his content deep and enjoyable. However, when I began to watch this particular debate, I couldn't help but be a little confused. See, the topic they were debating was, it is reasonable to reject Catholicism on philosophical grounds. And I hate to say it, but I felt as though every single argument Kevigen made in his opening statement was bad. See, all of his arguments hinge on the idea that nominalism is somehow true, and it doesn't matter whether you're a Platonist, a Catholic, a Buddhist, or whatever. The thing is, nearly every single ancient spiritual tradition rejects nominalism, and for good reason. So in this video, I'd like to respond to Kevin's arguments for nominalism primarily from a Platonic point of view. So let's start from the very beginning.
One argument against postulating abstract objects, or universals, or abstracta, it's all the same thing, is based on Occam's razor. I said I'd bring Occam up again. According to this principle, one should not multiply entities or kinds of entities unnecessarily. Thus, if one can show that certain concrete objects can perform all the theoretical roles usually associated with abstract objects, one should refrain from postulating abstract objects. The effectiveness of this appeal to Occam's razor is, of course, conditional upon us having shown that concrete objects can play all the same roles as the abstract objects, but I'll argue that they can. And in fact, most realists agree that they can. Most realists agree abstract objects are causally inert.
Okay, so the very first argument he makes is an argument for Occam's razor. Now, even though there are problems with Occam's razor, let's just assume that it's correct. The points that Kevigen makes still don't hold up to scrutiny. For example, his first point is not even considered to be true amongst the ancient Platonists. Platonists do believe that the forms cause things. I repeat, Platonists do believe that the forms cause things. The proof of this can be found in the earliest Platonic texts. Any discourse we have owes itself to the weaving together of forms, abstract objects. Again, here is Plato in the Republic. Then what gives the objects of knowledge their truth? In the knower's mind, the power of knowing is the form of the good. It is the cause of knowledge and truth. Notice here how Plato explicitly states that the forms, including the form of the good itself, are causes for knowledge. Now, to be clear, Platonists always use the term cause not to mean the beginning of a series of events in space and time, but rather that all things are somehow grounded in an ultimate truth-giving source. A ball cannot be a ball without circularity. Therefore, circularity itself, or the fundamental truth of circularity, is the cause of the ball's roundness. To remove the forms would create a situation of utter nonsense. Where does the ball's circularity, or the information collapsing the circularity of the ball into existence, come from? Does it just magically appear? No. And here we see how Occam's razor doesn't even defeat the forms. The forms are entirely necessary for the nature of reality to work as it does. In fact, it may be for this precise reason that William of Ockham doesn't even use his own razor to argue against the forms. In any case, let's see how Kevin continues to build his argument.
Other well-known nominalists include people like Francis Bacon, David Hume, and John Stuart Mill. Also, according to the Canadian philosopher of science, Ian Hacking, who actually just passed away, I think, earlier this year, most of science, contemporary science, I should say, is motivated by an unstated, nominalistic metaphysical worldview.
Oh yeah, this part is genuinely strange to me. There is not a single modern scientific experiment that requires the assumption that nominalism is true in order for that experiment to work. Can Kevin name a single one? Which pseudoscientists are the Platonists and the realists whose biases get in the way of recording information accurately? It's almost as if metaphysics and science are completely separate fields of study, since science deals with the study of matter and cause and effect, whereas metaphysics deals with ontology and the nature of being. Personally, I don't see this as a blow against abstract objects.
Point number 2 is mereological nihilism. Mereological nihilism is the denial of composite objects.
Ah, yes, mereological nihilism. Kevin provides an explanation that I think is a little convoluted, but if you want to take a look at it for context, here's the timestamp. I also recommend reading the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on mereological nihilism if you have the chance. In any case, I'll try to provide a simple explanation. Basically, things in the world exist, but most things are compounds of smaller things, such as atoms or fundamental building blocks. So if the compounds are reducible to their fundamental building blocks, we can't really say that the compounds genuinely exist. Only the simple fundamental building blocks truly exist. For example, if mountains are a real thing, when does a mountain end and the valley surrounding the mountain begin? Isn't it more likely that the mountain and the valley are the same and share in the same substance? In other words, the two objects don't genuinely exist independent of each other. But what does this have to do with the forms? Okay, here's the catch. If mereological nihilism were true, then forms couldn't exist because there would be no cause for the supposed differenceness between things, since those differences are simply an illusion and all things share in the same fundamental substance. As you can probably tell, there are some issues with this. First off, it contradicts what Kevin said earlier in the debate when he stated,
And it's also worth pointing out that some of the most famous deniers of abstract objects, some of the most famous nominalists, have not even based their nominalism on arguments at all. That is the case, for instance, for Goodman and Quine, who, in their steps towards a constructive nominalism, based their rejection of mathematical objects on basic intuition.
well, there's a problem, Kevin. Mereological nihilism goes against our intuition. Composite objects clearly exist. It's only in the heat of rigorous debate that we decide that composite objects must be some kind of illusion. Does that mean that mereological nihilism is probably false? That being said, there's still another more important issue at hand. If composite objects are nothing more than the interaction between parts, then what can be ascribed to the nature of the interaction between parts such that a whole with unique qualities is produced from those interactions? Why is it that altitude, rocks, and the particles which constitute their structure form a mountain as opposed to anything other than a mountain, such as a bicycle? What brings about the causes of particular objects if the underlying material substance is universally the same? Well, if you're a Platonist, then the explanation is quite simple. The universal substance is matter, but the immaterial cause of particularity is form. Logic compels us to admit that the material wholeness or cohesion of an object participates in some kind of causal substance, and this cause is the cause of all knowledge, the forms. As Plato says in the Theaetetus, Hesiod says about a wagon, "In a wagon are 100 pieces of wood. I could not name them all. No more, I imagine, could you. If we were asked what a wagon is, we should be content if we could mention wheels, axle, body, rails, yoke. He would think us just as ridiculous if we replied to the question about your own name by telling the syllables. He would say it is impossible to give a scientific account of anything short of adding your true notion of a complete catalogue of elements." Here, Plato is first and foremost showing the absurd consequences of what happens when we attempt to gain knowledge of the world around us by reducing objects to their smallest parts. Mereological nihilism is one of those consequences. However, Plato later provides a profound answer against reductionism, nominalism, and mereological nihilism in the Republic, where, following his analogy between the sun providing light to visible objects and the good providing intelligence to the forms, he states, "The good, therefore, may be said to be the source not only of the intelligibility of the objects of knowledge, but also of their being and reality." Also affirming this viewpoint is Syrianus, the late antique Platonist, who declares, "For even the good itself both brings into being intellection and unites it to the object of intellection, as the child and offspring of the good produces both vision and the object of vision simultaneously and relates them to one another." What we can conclude from this is that rather than ignoring our intuition that composite objects are real, we can explain that intuition by just making some intellectual space for the forms, which are the cause of the nature of composite objects and are also the cause of the knowledge of their existence. Phew, that was more long-winded than I expected, but I'm curious to see what Kevin says in the next part.
Okay, that was the second. The last thing that I'm going to talk about today is teleology.
Okay, so teleology is perhaps one of the most misunderstood subjects in philosophy, so let's see how Kevin breaks down his argument.
Aristotle argued that one of the reasons that an acorn grows into a tree is because an acorn has the telos of to grow into an acorn tree. Wikipedia puts the dividing line for teleology at the work Novum Organum by Francis Bacon, saying that since the publication of that work in 1620, teleological explanations in physical science tend to be deliberately avoided in favor of material and efficient causes, to put it still in Aristotelian language. But teleological language does still hold some sway today, particularly in biology. Biologists will use teleological language to describe bodily functions. The heart's purpose is to pump blood. And in evolution, the heart evolved to pump blood. But I will argue that many philosophically inclined biologists will say that this is simply an example of, quote, speaking with the vulgar. Vulgar not meaning like curse words, vulgar meaning the vulgate, the common folk.
So I'm actually very familiar with what Kevin is talking about here, and I think that there are some issues. For one thing, I absolutely would not expect biologists to use teleological language in any other way than purely figurative. Biologists are not metaphysicians. But on a more important note, I think Kevin ought to address the fact that most philosophers of biology still don't know how to concretely dismiss teleology altogether, even in its metaphysical, non-figurative versions. For example, it is quite clear in evolutionary biology that teeth were naturally selected to bite things, which allow for creatures with teeth to digest a variety of foods and defeat enemies in the animal kingdom. From a purely metaphysical standpoint, it is impossible to separate the object, in this case teeth, from its final end, biting. For example, we couldn't say that teeth were naturally selected to give better running speed to animals or anything like that. That final end is completely separate from teeth. There is no fundamental relationship there. This seems to prove that even on an empirical level, some kind of teleology exists, because teleology is really just the metaphysical unity between cause and effect. Biting could not exist without teeth. Digestion could not exist without the intestines. Procreation could not exist without sex. Ultimately, teleology simply asks the question, why must reality exist in such a way where these effects are always intrinsically linked to these causes? Honestly, arguments like these are so incredibly brute that it makes sense that philosophers of biology have actually created terms such as teleonomy in an effort to hand-wave away the obvious preponderance of teleology in their field of study. That being said, I know that Kevin also equates teleology with divine command theory, but I don't think that these things are correlated, because divine command theory is nothing more than the idea that God is a decree maker who sets arbitrary rules that happen to be found in nature, whereas teleology is more like an outgrowth of nature's participation in the fundamental rules of logic, and, more importantly, participation in the wholeness of unity. But I don't have time to do a deep dive on that, so moving on.
There's an article called Teleology, the explanation that bedevils biology, again published in the Oxford University Press in 2004, that begins like this. Biology is sick. Fundamentally unscientific modes of thought are increasingly accepted and dominate the way the subject is explained to the next generation. The heart of the problem is that we persist in making, literally then in brackets, making sense of a world in which we now know to be senseless, by attributing subjective values to the objects within it, values that have no basis in reality.
This part of the debate absolutely blew my mind. This is the equivalent of a Catholic priest quoting a paper by New Blackfriars, a Catholic research journal, to show how modern philosophy is sick because it doesn't accept theism as part of the mainstream. I'm sorry, but quoting a niche paper by an underpublished author is not going to prove anything. Earlier, Kevin was talking about the importance of consensus and how we should consider consensus in formulating our own worldview. But here he is quoting a single article with one author in an attempt to destroy any and all nuance when it comes to the question of how teleology is supposed to be interpreted in the field of biology. That is wild to me. I mean, I hate to sound like a broken record, but I'm about to reference once again the Stanford Encyclopedia. At the very top of the entry on this very subject, the encyclopedia writes, quote, teleological notions are largely considered ineliminable from modern biological sciences, end quote. I think there's certainly more room for nuance here. And wait, speaking of consensus,
More philosophers are nominalists than are realists, at least according to the 2020 Phil Papers survey.
it's important to note that this shift in attitude by philosophers is very, 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 very recent. Even as recent as 2009, those same Phil paper surveys record that a majority of philosophers were Platonists or believed that abstract objects genuinely exist. And you don't have to change your entire worldview to accept this. Even Joe Schmidt, an agnostic philosopher from the Majesty of Reason YouTube channel, is not a nominalist. Does that mean he's some kind of fringe thinker who hasn't clearly thought about his worldview? I mean, it's stuff like this that had me internally screaming during the debate, and it kind of signals that something more important and profound needs to be addressed here. In the introductory video to his channel, Kevin wrote on his note sheet that his worldview is predicated on wanting to make sure he is believing the most correct things. But what will he have gained when he finally does this? I think Kevin's viewpoint here leads us to ask a profound question. What is the goal of philosophy? I think that up until recently, the goal of philosophy was never to provide as many facts or answers about everything as possible. No, that was never the goal. Philosophy is not a Q&A sheet where we try to get some kind of final answer as to how everything works. Modern philosophers are perfectly aware of this limitation, but instead of choosing a worldview that is beautiful and full of wonder, a worldview that binds together the gaps left by nihilism and the limits of reason, most of these philosophers just choose the empty path and decide to throw their hands up and say, "We'll never know the answer," as if that could do any good for the world. It is a much healthier attitude to accept the answers we can obtain through reason, and then to pursue the good by cutting away our attachment to the two extremes of chasing immediate answers and letting go of the truth entirely. In other words, we need to practice patience and acknowledge that truth is inexhaustible. And if truth is inexhaustible, there comes a point where we do more good by accepting answers hiding in plain sight with a sense of gratitude and wonder, rather than asking questions which lead us further to the abyss.